Let us enter into this time of worship and celebration. In the safety of this sacred place, we are invited into a time of gratitude, reflection, renewal, and hope. Come in, bringing all of who you are. Calm your hurried pace. Know that you are not alone. There is strength and caring support for you here. Let us quietly reflect on these words.
Let us come together in prayer. Loving God, on this All Saints Sunday, we gather in this place, coming from our varied concerns and competing views, yet seeking our common humanity. Today, as we commemorate saints both known and unknown, may our eyes be opened, our hearts touched, and our wills empowered. Amen. This morning, our meditation is actually one of the lectionary readings for this Sunday. It's from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 19, verses 1 to 10. Hear what Luke writes. Entering Jericho, Jesus passed through the city. There was a wealthy person there named Zacchaeus, the chief tax collector. Zacchaeus was trying to see who Jesus was, but he couldn't do so because of the crowd, since he was short. In order to see Jesus, Zacchaeus ran on ahead, then climbed a sycamore tree that was along the route. When Jesus came to the spot, he looked up and said, "Zacchaeus, hurry up and come down. I'm going to stay at your house today." Zacchaeus quickly climbed down and welcomed Jesus with delight. When everyone saw this, they began to grumble. Jesus has gone to a sinner's house as a guest. Zacchaeus stood his ground and said to Jesus, "Here and now I give half my belongings to poor people. If I've defrauded anyone in the least, I'll pay them back fourfold." Jesus said to the tax collector, "Today's salvation has come to this house, for this is what it means to be a descendant of Sarah and Abraham. The promised one has come to search out and to save what was lost." May the words that we have heard bless us, and may our words be a blessing to others. Let us now spend a few moments centering our hearts and our minds and our lives. As a flame shines in the darkness, so may love and compassion, justice and peace shine in our hearts on this All Saints' Day and every day. Amen. Tomorrow evening we'll be celebrating Halloween. Our homes are going to be visited by tiny ghosts and goblins, tiny angels and superheroes, and countless other costume wee ones. They'll be ringing our doorbells and shouting out, "Trick or treat." I mention Halloween for two reasons. First, I've always liked Halloween. I liked it when I was a kid, standing on the outside of the door, knocking, shouting, "Trick or treat." That was a lot of fun. And now that I'm a bit older, I enjoy standing on the other side of the door and handing out the trick or treats. But perhaps for our purposes this morning, I mention Halloween because the story that I read to you earlier, the story of Zacchaeus in Luke 19, 1 to 10, that story has a trick or treat built right into it. Let me explain. And to begin, the name Zacchaeus literally means righteous one. Righteous one. And that would seem to be pure irony in this story, because we learned last week tax collectors And Zacchaeus is not just an ordinary tax collector, he's a chief tax collector, where Jews who collected taxes and tolls for the Romans who had conquered and occupied and brutally treated the people of Judea and Galilee. At the very least, a man with the name Zacchaeus, or righteous one, has a lot to live up to. Now, the gospel writer Luke tells us that Zacchaeus was wealthy, super rich, and people assumed, and readers of the Bible assumed, that he got super rich, really wealthy, by extortion, embezzlement, taking advantage of the elderly, exploiting the poor and the destitute, and looking after his cronies. That was a general perception of tax collectors at the time of Jesus. In this story, when it only appears in the Gospel of Luke, Zacchaeus is assumed to be thoroughly corrupt. He's assumed to be a despicable human being. He's assumed to be one who deserves the contempt of his neighbors. And for our purposes, I suppose, Zacchaeus is assumed to be one who has also earned the disdain of readers of the Bible. So on top of being filthy rich, corrupt, and despicable, Luke tells us that Zacchaeus was short. Think Danny DeVito short. He was so short that when Jesus and his ragtag entourage came into the city and they were on their way to Jerusalem, and they had to pass through Jericho on the way, when they came in to that city, probably the city where Zacchaeus lived and carried out his tax collecting and his toll business, this little man, this little Danny DeVito guy, wanted to see Jesus. Maybe he was eager, maybe he was desperate, it doesn't really tell us. So he did something that was really undignified, something that someone in his station in life should never have done. He got out in front of pushed himself out in front of the crowd, raced him down the street, climbed up in a big old sycamore tree, and probably hid in its leafy branches. The other thing I want to draw to your attention is the name of the city. This is very important for us to understand this story. It was Jericho. Jericho. Now, Jericho was located about 25 kilometers, about 17 miles from the city of Jerusalem. And according to the Hebrew Scriptures, Jericho was the place that the ancient Israelites returned to when they returned from bondage in Egypt. They were led to Jericho by Joshua, the successor of Joseph. Jericho had a nickname, and its nickname was the City of Palms, or the City of Palm Trees. Jericho's rich, fertile soil in the surrounding area and its temperate climate made it very, very important as an agricultural center in Judea. But that's not all. At the time of Jesus' public ministry, Jericho was an extraordinarily important administrative center, government administrative center. It was a commercial center. It was a trade center. And it was a holiday resort for well-heeled members of Jerusalem's aristocracy. And often, many, many desperately poor and sick people lived in the ditches and the highways and the byways around Jerusalem because these wealthy aristocrats were always coming and leaving the city, and those who were desperately poor and destitute would beg from them. These are the people who would have been in Jesus' entourage. Now, I mentioned earlier that Jericho was a trade center. It was at a crossroads for trade. And contemporary biblical scholars tell us that it's likely that Zacchaeus got his money, became rich, by collecting customs duties on goods that came in from Perea, a foreign land, into Judea. And not necessarily, and not entirely, was his wealth obtained from exploitation, embezzlement, and corruption. All the things that Jewish tax collectors were famous for. You should hold that little fact in your mind. Whatever the case, the people of Jericho still regarded Zacchaeus as a stinking rich chief tax collector and toll taker. They regarded him, and he had the reputation of one who had grown wealthy at the expense of the most vulnerable persons in the city and the surrounding area. And rightly or wrongly, his neighbors in Jericho despised him. So now, after saying those things, let's get back to the story. When Jesus reached the spot where Zacchaeus had hidden himself up in the big sycamore tree, Jesus looked up and told Zacchaeus, "Come on down." You remember from the reading, he said, "Zacchaeus, hurry up and come down here. I'm going to stay at your house, and I'm going to stay there today." So Zacchaeus quickly came down from his lofty perch, and he, Luke tells us, welcomed Jesus with delight. With delight. Well, the rest of the crowd wasn't so delighted. They started grumbling. They said, "Jesus has gone to the sinner's house. He's going to be a guest there." And right then and there, Zacchaeus stops. He stops, he turns to that crowd, and he defends himself. And it's in this defense that we discover the trick or treat of Luke's gospel story. You see, the interesting thing about the Zacchaeus story has to do with how it has been translated over thousands of years. This morning, for example, in our translation from the Inclusive Bible, Zacchaeus is quoted as saying to Jesus in the crowd, "Here and now I give half my belongings to the poor people. And if I've defrauded anyone in the least, I'll pay them back fourfold." Well, the verbs and the meaning and the interpretation and the implications in this translation are all future tense. Something Zacchaeus is going to do. Something Zacchaeus plans to do in the future. I went through several Bibles, New Modern Translations, and they all focus, except for one, on the future tense of these verbs. The translations generally tend to be this way: half my possessions I will give to the poor, and if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay back 4 times that much. And understanding these verbs that I'm talking about is key to understanding this parable. The verbs are future tense. And so we've interpreted this Zacchaeus story as a story of a chief tax collector being a penitent sinner. He meets Jesus. He's a very bad man. And as a consequence of meeting Jesus, he repents of his sins and he loosens his wallet. He promises to give half of his wealth away and 4 times as much if he's defrauded anybody. That's basically how we have understood the Zacchaeus story for decades. Zacchaeus, the penitent sinner, becoming repentant and sacrificially giving because of his encounter with Jesus. And that's fine and dandy as far as it goes. But you know, if you dig a bit deeper, if you examine the earliest manuscripts of Luke's gospel, if you check out the translations of the verbs quite carefully, they're not in the future tense. They're in the present tense. So in the story, here's what Zacchaeus, if we rely on the earliest manuscripts, actually said to Jesus and to the crowd. I give half of my wealth to the poor. I pay back 4 times as much if I have defrauded anybody. All the verbs are in present tense. Zacchaeus is not talking here about what he's going to do in the future. He's talking about what he is already doing. Things he's been doing even before meeting Jesus that day in Jericho. It turns out that this tax collector, this chief tax collector, who has experienced nothing but contempt from his neighbors and disdain from Bible readers, is far more generous and far more intentional about doing justice, probably than anybody else in Jericho. The verbs are in the present tense. And this gives us a very different portrait of Zacchaeus. It gives us a picture of Zacchaeus who lives up to his name as righteous one and just one. And that's why Jesus said, you have rightly belong to the house of Israel, for you have been righteous and you do justice. Being so despised by your neighbors, being pushed into the margins of Jericho's society, should come to an end. In other words, the trick in the story of Zacchaeus encountering Jesus that day in Jericho is not, as we have assumed for years, decades, not a repentant story. It's not a story of sacrificial giving. And the treat in this story is that it's a story of grace. God's grace. God's grace that was available to Zacchaeus in his day and age, where he could accept God's salvation, which means God's liberation and God's restoration. It's the same grace, the grace of God, that makes it possible for you and for me to accept our salvation, our emancipation, and our redemption right here, right now. So again, let me repeat, based on the verbs, based on grammar, Zacchaeus in this story is not a repentant sinner, nor is he a sacrificial giver. The point of the story is the grace of God. And so we do have something of a Halloween story. We have in the story of Zacchaeus a trick and a treat. Well, what should we take away from the story of Zacchaeus? Well, if we want to get right down to brass tacks, we remember that the leading Jesus scholar, Dominic Crossan, reminds us that Luke's story of Zacchaeus is a parable. A parable. It's not a parable by Jesus, it's a parable about Jesus. And in this parable, as parables are prone to do, Jesus is once again turning our understanding of life and the world upside down. He's turning our prejudices and our assumptions upside down. More than that, though, as the biblical scholar and Anglican priest, Dr. Elizabeth Caton, and her Anglican colleagues, Sarah Dillon Brewer, have pointed out recently, the story of Zacchaeus demonstrates for us the tricks we play in our own minds. The tricks we play in our own minds before deciding how we're going to treat a person or any group of persons. In other words, the Zacchaeus story asks you and me whether or not we're going to be inclusive. Asks us as individuals and as a congregation. Are we going to include certain persons or a certain group of persons in our workplaces and in our marketplaces? Are we going to include them in our societies and in our clubs? Are we going to include a certain person or a certain group of persons in our schools or colleges and universities? Are we going to include them in our own social group? Are we going to include them in our own church? Are we going to include them, or are we going to push them to the margins? Caton and Burr have put it this way: the Zacchaeus story shows us a trick we play in our minds before we treat one another one way or another. And it seems to me that tomorrow night, when we celebrate Halloween, there is something about this celebration that underscores what this story is about. Tomorrow night, sweet little angels dressed as witches. Others, sweet as they may be, will be dressed up as dangerous beasts and demons. And there'll be some real little devils from our neighborhood who'll be there dressed up as superheroes, prepared to defend us from all evil. They'll come to our doors and they'll call out, "Trick or treat." And in their own childlike way, these Halloween characters will try to use their cuteness, or maybe they'll try to scare us, or maybe they'll try to trick us into giving them a treat of some sort. The thing is, we don't judge these kids. We don't make any assumptions about them. We don't just make assumptions or use prejudices because of how they appear on the outside, what their costumes might look like, or the characters they might be emulating. At Halloween, there's no place for meanness or pushing one kid aside. No point in favoring one kid over another. On Halloween, we go out of our way to be fair, to do the right thing to each of these children. Now, I know that the people in Jericho and Zacchaeus and Jesus are not costumed Halloween characters. I know they haven't come into our lives by way of story just to convince you and me that they're good people, or they want to frighten us or trick us into being religious and moral and ethical. I know that. But I do know this. Sometimes we don't get past what's on the outside of the person. We don't get past what we've assumed about that person or that group of persons. We don't get past the costume. We don't get past our assumptions, and sometimes even our mean-spiritedness towards that person or those people. And over again, I've observed, we end up falsely accusing the very person of something, just like the crowd did in Jericho, like they did with Zacchaeus, accusing the very person whose example we really should be following. As Halloween draws near, the trick is for you and me to recognize Zacchaeus and all the people we encounter, to recognize that the people we encounter are children of God, to recognize all people as God's delight, that all people are a treat for God's heart, regardless of how they might dress or behave or talk or work or live or worship or anything else. May it be so. Amen. Let us remember in this Halloween season that the real treat for us is that we don't act this way just on Halloween, but we strive to act this way every day. This is Reverend Del Stewart. I hope you enjoyed this audio presentation of today's time of worship and celebration. If you did, please click the like button. You can also click on subscribe to make it easier to find our channel, and click the bell to receive a notification each time a podcast becomes available. Peace and joy now from Westminster United Church in Windsor, Ontario.